and welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun Cho. With little progress in the U.S.-North Korea denuclearization talks, there are growing calls, especially in the U.S. Congress, to start thinking about a Plan B or the next phase to the current diplomacy. Today, we discuss what that alternative can be.
또 한 차례의 초대형 방사포 시험 사격을 성과적으로 진행했습니다.
At some point, you have to say, "God, are they going to ever do anything?" Look, I'm always appreciative that people are willing to have a conversation, but you get frustrated that we don't have a deal yet.
In the studio with me today, Colonel David Maxwell, Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Colonel Maxwell was a planner for the United Nations Command and the Combined Forces Command. Also joining me, Mr. Scott Snyder, Director of U.S.-Korea Policy Program at the Council on Foreign Relations. His latest book, South Korea at the Crossroads, charts the evolution of South Korean foreign policy and strategic choices. Welcome to the program.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Thank you.
Now, Mr. Snyder, as the talks hit an impasse, there are growing calls, even among Republican senators, to start thinking about Plan B. And the Democrats have been making the same calls since mid-year. So what do you make of this reaction from Congress?
It's a natural reaction to the fact that no progress has been made in the negotiating track between the United States and North Korea. And so there's frustration that this pathway is not successful, and so there's a desire to put greater pressure on North Korea in order to try to achieve something.
Mm-hmm. And is this the right time to start thinking about Plan B?
Yes, I think it is. And I think the congressional push for that is an illustration of the bipartisan support that exists within Congress for Korean security. And so I think that at this point in time, and of course, since April, Kim Jong-un has put an expiration date on the Kim-Trump romance. And so at the end of the year, if the United States does not change its character, as the North has said, that's really going to be the expiration date. So it's imperative now that we really look at the policy and develop a Plan B.
Mm-hmm. So what can be the kind of Plan B that we can think of at this stage?
Well, I think that, I think we have to continue diplomacy. I think that, we must continue to engage and reach out. But we have to look at our military posture. We have to look at sanctions enforcement. Clearly, our maximum pressure 1.0 in 2017 and 18 brought North Korea to the table. But sanctions have been eroding. Sanctions enforcement has been eroding. And so that needs to be addressed. But we also need to look at other areas of pressure, including cyber defense and cyber offense, as well as information influence activities to really put internal pressure on Kim Jong-un. Kim Jong-un has got to experience the pressure from within his elite, his military, and the Korean people, because he has failed. We are looking at the diplomatic efforts as failing on our part, but really, in effect, he has failed. He's failed to get relief from sanctions. He's failed to reach an agreement. And so that pressure really needs to continue to be put on him to get him to make the right strategic decision in return for a brighter future.
Mm-hmm.
I agree with David, especially on the maximum pressure and the revamping of that on the economic side. Increasingly, we see calls in Congress for secondary sanctions, and I think that those are going to grow stronger. In addition, I think we need to shore up our extended deterrence commitment, and we need to underscore our commitment to presence on the peninsula. Mm-hmm. As a way of indicating, especially in light of the debate over special measures agreement, that the U.S. is not going to pull back or walk away.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So both of you are talking about more pressure on North Korea economically and militarily, but why doesn't the Plan B involve more engagement, more dialogue, more incentives?
Well, because the North Koreans have put a limit on dialogue. I think on the U.S. side, we've been looking for that continuously. If anything, the North Koreans have detected that we're overeager for dialogue, and it makes them think that we are willing to give in too early. But what we really need is for the North Koreans to come out, spend more time with us, understand our side, and also explain their side in greater detail. It does not necessarily mean that we can close the gap, but at least we'll have a better understanding of why the gap exists.
And on that over-eagerness, Secretary Pompeo recently said that this progress has been far too slow, but he is still optimistic. He is still hopeful that there will be progress in the coming months. So what do you think are the grounds for his optimism?
It's difficult to say, but I think it may be that he is hopeful that Kim Jong-un is going to change his mind. You know, as Scott said, we have been open to talks since Singapore. We have been ready for working level talks really at a moment's notice. But it has been Kim Jong-un who has really not allowed the process to go forward. He has not allowed substantive working level negotiations. He has never sent a nuclear expert to those working level negotiations, which I think is an indication of his insincerity about denuclearizing North Korea. And so, but I think Secretary Pompeo may believe that the pressure is being put on Kim Jong-un. I mean, he's backed himself into a corner. He has really established his red line as the end of the year, and time may not be on his side. And so our offers to talk remain on the table. I think that we will continue to engage, but he's the one that has to make the decision, and he's the one that has failed to do so far.
And South Korea's National Intelligence Service says that its calculation is that Kim Jong-un has set his mind to have another summit with President Trump in December. So the question here is, would President Trump be interested in another summit with Kim Jong-un in December?
I think President Trump might be interested in another summit with Kim Jong-un in December, but it's not the right time for another summit. And I think the real problem is that increasingly there are risks associated with having another summit that also doesn't generate progress. Summitry has been a great media play for Trump, but increasingly, if it doesn't generate progress, it's going to be viewed negatively. And also, I think that for Kim Jong-un, the benefits have kind of run out in terms of having those kinds of meetings, because increasingly it exposes him actually as having misled potentially the Western world about his commitment to complete denuclearization.
So what's more likely, if there is a summit, what's more likely, a bad deal or a good deal at this point?
If there's a summit without proper preparations, then obviously a bad deal is more likely. The problem, I think the challenge of making a good deal right now is that we just haven't had the level of engagement necessary. And also, actually, the North Koreans themselves, I think, have set out to achieve a particular objective, actually affirmation as a nuclear state, that is beyond the U.S. bottom line. It's unattainable through negotiations at this time. And so without a course correction, I don't think that it's going to be possible for us to move forward in an effective way through diplomacy. And diplomacy is what we have to use in order to close that gap.
I think that Kim Jong-un is mistaken if he thinks he can get a deal directly and only through President Trump. And if I were advising President Trump, in the next exchange of letters between Kim and Trump, I would spell out to Kim Jong-un that there can be no third summit until there are substantive working level negotiations. They really need to bring an agreement to the two leaders. And so if Kim doesn't commit to working level negotiations and developing that agreement, President Trump should not enter into any kind of summit until that happens.
So North Korea is obviously not interested in working level talks, but if we change the perspectives, why is working level talks also important for North Korea?
Until Kim Jong-un wakes up, understands true international diplomacy and acts as a responsible member of the international community, which he has not done so far, and allows working level talks, he is not going to be successful. And so he really has to change his calculus, and that's why working level talks are so important to him. They are natural for us, and they are natural for every other country in the world. But Kim Jong-un is reluctant, or perhaps is afraid. He's afraid that his negotiators will get out-negotiated. And so I think that until he changes his calculus, we're not going to see progress.
One problem with the focus on working level talks is it actually boils down the issues to a certain kind of impression that it's a process issue. But I actually think that the core issue is that North Korea, it's such an isolated regime, it's so dominated by Kim Jong-un. He has a goal, and he really is not used to the idea of quid pro quos or exchanges in order to achieve that goal. And his goal is actually not a goal that can be achievable through negotiation with the United States because it's beyond the U.S. bottom line. And so it's very common in Korean negotiating behavior for groupthink to take over and for people to think about objectives in terms of what they need without thinking about what the other side needs. And I think that's what's missing in the North Korean calculation, and it's going to have to be readjusted.
And Deputy Special Representative for North Korea, Alex Wong, Mr. Wong said that a peace regime on the Korean Peninsula is an important part of President Trump's vision for North Korea. So doesn't it sound a little bit off from what North Korea wants from the United States from now?
Surely, but we must remember that the agreement in Singapore specified that we would work towards a peace regime as we work towards denuclearization. So Alex Wong is really reiterating the position that Kim Jong-un agreed to and President Trump agreed to. So while it seems far-fetched and most people think that you can't have peace until there's denuclearization, I think Alex Wong is pointing out that Kim Jong-un agreed to seeking peace on the Korean Peninsula. And this is another indication of his sincerity and what he really wants. Does he want peace? Does he want to denuclearize? Does he want to be a responsible member of the international community and have a country that is a normal functioning country? Because right now it is not.
How does this vision of peace and a bright future for North Korea bring about North Korea's immediate action changes and calculus?
Well, it hasn't so far, but essentially what we're doing is we are expressing non-hostile intent to a counterpart that believes that the fundamental obstacle to moving forward is U.S. hostility toward North Korea. And so I think we're actually showing that we're willing to meet North Korea halfway. The question continues to be whether the North Koreans will also come halfway to meet us.
Now, Mr. Snyder, Assistant Secretary Stilwell, when asked about red lines for North Korea, he said that when you draw red lines, you're going to box yourself into a corner, so it's just better to leave it ambiguous. But isn't it about time that U.S. is also stern about North Korea's continued provocations?
Yeah, there has been a view that North Korea views red lines as red carpets, as invitations to take the action that you don't want them to take. But I think it's pretty clear, based on the developments of the summer, that the U.S. has been too permissive related to short-range missile testing, and that we really need to get back to the UN Security Council as a way of trying to draw a ceiling for North Korea's actions.
Well, we'll have to leave it here and now watch video for our next discussion.
In an actual conflict, North Korea, in my view, could use transporter erector launchers to operationally operate intercontinental range ballistic missiles.
It's a reduced scope from the former Vigilant Ace exercises, but it meets all the requirements of the ROC Air Force, the U.S. Air Force to ensure readiness.
South Korea's National Security Advisor Chung Eui-young and other top officials said it is technically difficult for North Korea to fire intercontinental ballistic missile from mobile launchers. This has raised controversy in South Korea over whether North Korea indeed has the capability. Now, Colonel Maxwell, in 2017, North Korea fired ICBMs Hwasong 14 and 15, moved them through mobile launchers, and then launched them. And yes or no question to you, does North Korea have the ability to launch ICBM on top of the transporter erector launcher?
Yes, it appears so, and I think we should assume so. They've demonstrated the Hwasong 14 and 15. What we don't know is if they've miniaturized a nuclear warhead to be able to be mounted on those. But I'm a subscriber to to Sun Tzu, and you never assume the enemy won't attack. You make yourself invincible. And until it can be proven otherwise, I think we have to assume that North Korea has advanced its program, and that is the purpose of all the testing that they have done. And
so then, what do you make of South Korean officials' interpretation that because the ICBMs were launched on top of a launch table that is detached from tails, that it is not technically launched from tails?
Yeah. Well, I think that and those are only some Korean officials. Others do believe that they have the capability to do so, and I think that there are some officials who want to minimize the threat and minimize the tensions, and so they are saying that they don't have the capability. And what's most important, though, they may be minimizing the threat because that threat is to the United States. And what we don't want to have is to Kim Jong-un to try to make a deal where he might give up his ICBMs and make a deal with President Trump in return for things that are not good for the alliance. And so I think there are some that think that by minimizing that threat, that the U.S. won't enter into a bad deal because of the ICBM capability. But we need to be realistic about it.
And Mr. Snyder, another point raised by a South Korean official was that once Dongchangri missile facility is completely abolished, North Korea won't be able to launch ICBMs. But we're talking about mobile launchers here. So what is your take on his comment?
Well, David has already just refuted the idea that Dongchangri is critical to ICBM launch capability. And so I think that clearly is not the case. I think maybe what we're talking about is a potential vulnerability related to the number of transporter erector launchers, but we don't necessarily know what's in North Korea's inventory. So it's very dangerous to try to make speculation about that even. And the critical issue, I think, is that most of these recent tests have really represented a growing threat to the South. And yet that is also being downplayed. It's being covered over by an effort to focus on and keep alive the idea that the North Korean threat is being reduced.
So you briefly did touch upon it, but what would be the motivation for South Korea to keep on playing down North Korean capabilities?
Well, I personally believe that it reflects an overinvestment in the political relationship with North Korea, even after the North Koreans have already removed the benefits that had been accrued for that relationship. It's really the main platform that the Moon administration stands on in foreign policy, and he's holding on to it tightly, but the trend lines are not in his favor.
And Colonel Maxwell, the joint air drill between ROK and the United States was canceled last year, but then revived this year in a smaller scale than the Vigilant Ace. And North Korea issued an angry statement that its patience has hit its limits. So why is North Korea so afraid of joint air drills?
Afraid is right. Kim Jong-un should be afraid. He should be very afraid, especially when they use F-35s and F-22s and F-15s. Those aircraft can penetrate anywhere in North Korea. They can attack any target. They can destroy the leadership of North Korea. They can destroy nuclear launch sites. So Kim Jong-un is right to be afraid. However, we should also keep in mind that while we are conducting smaller exercises, North Korea continues to conduct its winter training exercise with 1 million soldiers, larger than any ROK-US exercise that takes place, larger than the combination of all the exercises that take place in a single year. So North Korea is very hypocritical in calling us out for routine training while they conduct massive military training through the winter training cycle.
So as Colonel Maxwell just mentioned, United States and ROK has downsized the military drills to prop up diplomacy. But if North Korea is going to get angry either way, whether we downsize the drills or not, then isn't it better to just return to the larger exercises?
Well, I would put that on the question of whether we're actually moving forward with diplomacy as the measure. And so in the absence of diplomacy, I would say that there's going to be an increasing pressure maybe to go back to the old exercise regime, because the effort to make space for diplomatic progress has proven not to be successful.
And Colonel Maxwell, North Korea continued to test artillery against South Korea, and there are longer ranges now, and now even target Camp Humphreys and Pyeongtaek. So North Korea tried to target these bases in South Korea. Is it somehow connected to its fears of air drills?
Well, yes, certainly. In July, KCNA said they were testing these systems to be able to target a fat target, which is likely Camp Humphreys, Osan Air Base, and Cheongju Air Base, where the ROK F-35s are based. And so I think the purpose of developing these systems are really twofold. One is to enhance their leverage at negotiations, to increase the threats. It supports their blackmail diplomacy, raise tensions to gain political and economic concessions. But also they have a very real warfighting capability. And the ability to target these areas at the start of hostilities, would in their mind, would give them an advantage. Now, once they begin the war, those systems would be destroyed very quickly. But they want to develop that capability because they're always seeking asymmetric advantages, and this is one type that they're trying to develop.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think that basically the North Koreans use pauses in order to try to achieve particular tactical or strategic objectives that they need. Mm-hmm. And so when they've seen these pauses, they've taken those opportunities.
Mm-hmm. And does South Korea have effective missile defense system to guard against North Korean artillery and the short-range missiles?
Well, there's no system that guards against artillery. We conduct what is called counterfire, which we target the firing systems of North Korea using air power, using our artillery, our rocket systems, ROK and US. And we do have capabilities against many of their missile systems, but the KN-23, frankly, is able to penetrate these systems because there is no single air defense system that defends against all types of missiles. This is why you need to have multiple missile defense capabilities, and they need to be integrated between South Korea, the US, and Japan. And so there really needs to be an integrated missile defense system where the three countries can use their strengths to ensure that gaps are filled, information is shared, targeting is conducted. So we need to have an integrated missile defense capability, but missile defense is harder than missile attack. And everyone needs to understand that. It's easier to attack something with a missile than it is to defend against that missile.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. Snyder, North Korea's artillery and short-range missiles are solely targeted against South Korea, not against Japan, not against the United States. Do you think the Seoul government should show more stern reactions to North Korea?
Yes, but USFK is vulnerable.
Yeah.
And so what's really interesting, I think, about what North Korea is doing is that it used to be the case that South Korea referred to USFK as the tripwire that was going to draw us in. But it turns out that the North Koreans seem to value the tripwire function maybe even more than South Korea, and I find that fascinating.
Mm-hmm. Well, we'll leave it here and now move on to our next segment. Now, time for the photo moment. Today, we have a photo of a science expo in Pyongyang last month. This particular picture is a multi-use heating device using solar energy. A Chinese industry website also reported North Korea plans to grant China access to a rare earth mine in exchange for investment in solar energy to ease its chronic power shortages. This was later dismissed by the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson. Mr. Snyder?
Well, it's interesting that North Korea also is interested in alternative energy forms, and I think that we know that North Korea has some big energy problems. The idea of trading new frontier energy for old frontier energy resources is fascinating, even if it is not confirmed.
Mm-hmm. Colonel Maxwell?
Yes, I think this is an illustration of the difficulties that North Korea faces with energy, but it also shows that the Korean people in the North they're creative, they're adapting, and they're trying to use whatever is possible. And this is really a very simple and old solar technology when you really look at it, and they're touting it as something, something great. But it really is an illustration of the dire straits they are in with energy. But the Korean people in the North have the creative ability to overcome these types of challenges.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Mr. Snyder, Colonel Maxwell,
thank you.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you. And this was Washington Talk from the Voice of America, and I'm Eun Jang Cho. Join us next week for more analysis on North Korea.